Hello everyone, today we talk about Günther von Schwarzburg's armor in the tomb effigy at the Dome of Frankfurt am Main that illustrates a beautiful German panoply of the mid-14th century. Günther von Schwarzburg was a king of Germany. He had been a Wittelsbach partisan, thus opposed to the rise of Charles of Luxembourg as King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor eventually. And he died in 1349, which is the same date of the effigy, probably because of the Black Death. And this figure is very fascinating. I visited it, I saw it back in the day. It's a beautiful, famous monument, and it's illustrating essentially certain specific characteristics of of typical German style in armor, right? So at this point in European arms and armor history, especially in the West, there's not a dramatic difference. There is an homogenization. There are certain styles, certain typologies, certain technical devices in the realization of the various elements of the armor that are worth considering in this specific case. For example, if you look at the arms and legs, these are protected by leather strengthened with metal splints and rivets. Right, this was very popular in German armor, especially from the late 13th century until, say, the 80s of the 14th. As we will see, this is partly, similar to what the Sabatons are realized like, and so it's this interspersion fundamentally of leather with metal. And there is in René d'Anjou, Traité de la forme et de vie dans Tournois, that is a source of the mid-15th century, how the avant-bras and the garde-bras of cuir bouilli, strengthened with 5 or 6 narrow splints, quote, with the width of a finger, right, as you can't see properly here, were somewhat typical of knightly equipment in Brabant, in Flanders, Hainaut, and, quote, other countries towards Germany, which is maybe a hint of the fact that we see this in fact in Germany proper, at least from that more French Western perspective. You see these other areas between France and Germany would make up the Flemish and Burgundian, broadly speaking, mantles of Brabant, in fact, and other say smaller regions as an area of great that wasn't properly defined by concrete state or reality. Eventually, the so-called Burgundian state, which was just a sum, but nevertheless a quite important one and importantly centralized for the time standards, would emerge from here. But still, it was an importantly developed area that, as we know, wasn't per se like there was a strong feudality in some areas, but especially in Flanders, that was also essentially a more popular component, and especially also an important technological advancement. Right, Flanders at this point was exporting a significant amount of military hardware in surrounding countries, especially in England, and it was very technologically advanced, for example, firearms, etc. So it's significant that this source points how this, which wouldn't appear as a particularly advanced thing, right? The idea is that now armor is advancing, in metal, it's heading towards, right, in the second half of the 14th century, plate armor is literally taking over, and there is an ever greater sophistication, probably of certain type of armor. Think about the spread of brigandines and so on. So that point at the need of a flexibility. So from one side, what will evolve in, let's say, the heavier type of fighter as in full plate armor, and next to him something that is considerably heavy. By the 15th century, fundamentally, there is the greatest degree of armoredness in the history of warfare, right? And but with solutions that were oriented also to flexibility, right? And it's fascinating in this area specifically that didn't have seemingly particularly to envy to others, at least in material wealth, right? Because at this point, actually, armor, the most advanced center in armor production was Lombardy, right? But not just for the sheer scale of product produced, etc., but properly for the systematic, the organization and the quality, the almost proto-industrial regime of production and organization would be just southern Germany at some point emerging. Here there are broader metallurgical improvements also because of the increase of hydraulic, in fact, furnaces and so on that would allow to melt at metal at higher temperatures, so conferring certain characteristics to make it to work it more effectively, to obtain a higher quality of steel and so on. So maybe yes, these were not quite literally the most advanced areas, but still were areas where there had been an important degree of experimentation, of work, of spread. Considered that Germany itself was the place in which plate armor is to be observed before the other European countries. Like in a few decades, it was present in lower Europe. So this premise is not necessarily connected, especially on the eastern border, in eastern Germany. It wasn't particularly advanced per se, like a particularly elevated metallurgical capacity. It's just that evidently all Europe was ready for that kind of thing to spread because it could support it, right? It was needing it in the market of war and so on. But still, it is to be considered that German chivalry at this point is really a very advanced thing. It's fighting basically mostly at this point in Italy. There are very massive components of German mercenaries, famously enough, that bring in fact their own kind of style, as we will see. So again, this typical German, or if you want Burgundian, bias of interspersing metal splints and rivets into fundamentally a leather armor, right, is noticeable with interest. And as we were saying before, with the sabatons as well, right, the foot armor is similarly of rivet reinforced leather. And scholars such as Claude Blair disappeared when it was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, was observing how the Germans, quote, apparently had no great liking for male sabatons, right? And even in here, you would question why, right? Because again, we try to find simplistic explanations with monofactorial system, which is not the case, right? It's not that the male sabaton per se was something that was more or less liking to Germans specifically, or to any other people in itself. We should understand whether this was just first of all how true that was, because we don't have literally the picture of the complete picture of all what the sabatons were made of in every place wherever the Germans also fought, in the same Germany or abroad. But we just noticed that in that area there is a greater inclination towards this again leather armor, which if you see here in the picture, of course this was a German, not just a German knight, but also a hell of an aristocrat. So we see fundamentally the best right here. Look at the at all look at the hand protection. All it's very advanced, right? It's very refined and developed as an armor, right? So the question would be why, in general, maybe the most encompassing question that may have brought in Germany this kind of bias is maybe the same lack of certain of metal in a way, at least in certain areas. We don't know. It's not necessarily a matter of being rich in mineral resources or not. Simply could simply mean what was the market going like, right? This is a moment of actually an important economic crisis all over Europe. A good half of Germany wasn't really topping, the levels of development of the rest of the West. In fact, so it may be part of an intensely within an intensely feudalized country. Still, the lack so with a lot of knights that were in fact working abroad because they couldn't find they were impoverished, right? All here the class of the ministeriales had virtually disappeared in juridical terms, but the rise of princes in Germany after the collapse of central monarchy had substantially worsened their living conditions. So it may be that such style was just trying to use less metal because that costs, right? And yes, this may sound as a monofactorial explanation. We should find it at that point in all kind of say the less developed areas that weren't swimming in metal, let's say in local economy. But it's just like an idea like this, because otherwise German armor was famous in a sense for its heaviness, right? For its weight, and it had brought to important changes. I mean, German style in armor brought to important changes also in the armor of other countries. So this doesn't quite explain everything, and there should be. I'm sure that the experts in arms and armor, specifically in Germany, in this specific context, could provide a much more, a much more cogent and especially a simpler explanation after all. But that's the simplest that I could think of banally. Then we see here Günther carrying a helm, right, with a crest that is unlikely to have been worn in action, but we should never be so sure of that. Meaning that that's an important part of combat psychology. It should never be given for granted that just because something was like these crests were, as you know, really light. They were made of very the perishable material in a sense. So in combat, yes, it could have easily been destroyed by any blow it could get. So in part, the functionality of it, if you really cared for it to remain there in the first place, may be a concern. But given that in battles people killed each other and could destroy entire principalities and forts to survive, etc. Going in battle in that moment with just a crest, saying I don't give a damn, I will do it because I'm determined to win or die. Right, it's not to be understood. And crests existed for one specific reason, and were still very, very popular at the time in general. In so many panoplies that, and even in if you look at the iconographic representations, thinking about the Manessa Code, etc. Yeah, it could be an ideal, right? It could be a license, but I think that looking at somebody with a crest that looks intimidating, and especially that makes you recognized, right? In this case was a monarch, so it was just important, right? It was a way also to be spared, to be saved. There's all a literature on the base of their rank, because those who were not, wouldn't bring you anything in terms of ransom. What's the point of making them live, right? Nobody cared. And there is a specific literature about German. And this German customs, let's say, of sparing nightly life, that is to be found even abroad. This was documented, for example, in Italy extensively, that the Italians were observing how the German mercenaries were somewhat even overly confident they would have been spared in their life, and there was a lot of implications here because of the free companies that if you had killed part of these guys, first of all they could have. Some others could have turned against you, because there was also partly a kind of national feeling in spite of all the divisions within Germany, because the Germans hated each other guts as much as the Italians in that sense. So, but there was a custom, let's say, to let them free, because in a sense German mercenaries represented a bit of a legacy you wanted of an hypothesis of imperial legitimization that you wanted to maintain under your own control as a prestigious lord, and this is extremely evident in so many Ghibelline lordships in northern Italy that were absolutely very involved actually in the various in German politics at this time, because they were all one with the Habsburgs, with the Luxembourgs, that famously enough, in fact, they also launched campaigns in Italy and so on, and that's why also there were so many German mercenaries there. So the idea of being something more, it could be also recognized amidst the rest of the troop that at this point wasn't that segmented tactically, meaning that around this point we are at that time in history when, yes, cavalry is kind of articulating tactically at a point where the heavier guy is becoming ever heavier and therefore can do ever less things but just a shock charge, while there were other lighter troopers on horseback emerging kind of support. They had always been there actually, but the picture that we get is that especially for German mercenaries in abroad, you see that their specialty was just heavy cavalry, and that there was a degree of uniformity even in equipment, etc., that at this point for professionals entailed like this important full panoply. Here we see just a very important guy, but don't think that the average mercenary would have been particularly different from that. Here there is also all in terms of the materials, etc., all a qualitative consideration that things were different in quality, right? And you could acquire them through different channels, so it's not easy to measure that. But if we see, again, heavily armored German mercenaries, like another, and fundamentally with a very few accompaniment, right? And we are in the phase of refeudalization of European warfare after this is probably the end of the rise of commoners and peasants as infantry, etc. They're coming down again, also because the Black Death is literally decimating them, and so these mercenaries come back more on the fore. We're observing an important degree of armoredness that, in fact, as we were saying, will evolve into that even more professional system we see in the 15th century. In terms of armies organization, it's very different from the one of the first half of the 14th. In any case, these were few, especially in Germany, these were radically, let's say, they were military culture radically soaked into chivalric feudal ideals, and they were quite unstable, quite turbulent areas, right? And there was a degree of militarization that you don't quite find in many other areas, because especially in the East, but you could say arguably in the West too, in terms of political boundaries, that or at least of their stability, there isn't really a frontier, right? You don't really know where Germany ends, and these knights were involved in an ever more far-ranging international military involvement, and also their homeland wasn't that immune from such important changes. In any case, they were attracted in many other places where the money stood, right? So this differences in more latter, right, in this specific area, I can't really think of anything. It could be just like a fashion in the sense that after all, yes, there were other factors that were in to be taken in consideration. For example, like, I don't know, so that, as we've seen, this might not be standard. If you look at the armor of Walter Boffingen in 1359, or even the one of the Archbishop von Trier in 1312, you see actually very heavy. There is no letter there. Again, we should see what's the quantity, what's statistically the spread, right? Because for that matter, at that point, Germany might have not necessarily made more use of letter in relative terms than other countries. It may just, other countries might have depicted things differently, or the Germans might have depicted them for some other reason. Maybe it was just a stylistic, aesthetical thing, but who knows, right? There is always, let's say, even aesthetics that did play a part like in the Crests, right? It's always psychological. There's always a functionality, and it's also always a material one, right? It's not just to be given for, like, this is pure aesthetics, and there is no concreteness materially to it. But again, these are just speculations, just to say how complex some certain systems are to try to understand. And so, as you see here, there is a home. The Germans were famous for their great helm, right? But what you see he wearing, as would be in part normal in that sense at the time, is a bassinet à bretèche that was popular, in fact, in Germany and Italy between the 40s and the 70s of the 14th century. And that speaks for, in fact, would be the standard, as even iconographically. If you look at the Code of Baldwin of Trier, if you look at the expedition of Henry VII in Italy, etc., you see that degree of uniformity, that in spite of all the customizations, the artisanal production and so on, did exist as a standard of the knight in a way, of what an average heavy cavalryman had to be. And what is interesting in Günther von Schwarzburg's effigy about his helmet is actually that the male hood had an inbuilt nozzle, right? You can see it in the picture. Basically, you have the surface of the bassinet, and then the nozzle is not outside. It's inside, right? And from the outside, you can just see this two studs passing through the helmet on the brow, and where you could hook the male hood, right? With a lace that in the picture I've inserted it, but basically it would basically be this slice arriving up to the studs in the center of your forehead and covering essentially your nose, but leaving the eyes open, so until eventually the male essentially closed around them, and let's say more or less at the level, in fact, of your nose to down, so your mouth was also covered in mail. And this is just a type. There are others actually. For example, there's a form of visor, usually referred to by its modern name of a clap visier, that evolved from this type of inbuilt nozzle in the 60s of the 14th century, circa. So this fundamentally was hinged by the middle of its top edge to a vertical bar, was similarly attached, in fact, to the internal side of the helmet by two studs on the brow. And there were different types, by the way. For example, the tomb effigy of Konrad von Kronenberg, died 1372, or the more unusual type of clap visier, as it is present, for example, in a Bohemian altarpiece around the 80s of the 14th century, that consists in this cage that fundamentally the visier is meant to be, but constituted by a central spine, let's say, various ribs on the side of the face. Well, this, in combat, even if you're on horseback, you really are quite solicited by shocks and movements, independently from whether you take a full blow in the face at that point. Unless in fact the vizier is up, you don't risk too much, rather than the things being stuck mostly in your face at that point. But yeah, I mean, this is pretty much the standard, if you want. It is bassinet with a clap visier, and this male aventail, if you want. And yeah, so we will keep talking about these things as well. What is important to stress is that the type of armor depicted in Günther von Schwarzburg's Effigy is a type of armor also appearing in Italy, where it was introduced by German mercenaries, right? And in fact, it is to be found in a large number of Italian illustrations, especially in the second half of the 14th century. So it's something, in fact, that we were saying is shifted more towards the second half, but it was evidently originating before, right? And it's worth noticing because of the deep connections between these European regions at the time. And for now, we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.